Okie dokie. So the 4.0 patch for Honkai Star Rail brought with it the Elation Path, which while that does have its own bundle of quirks and fuckery, if you want to go learn about that, I've made videos about that recently. It also brought with it the Nova Flare buff reworks for Sparkle and Black Swan. And we're actually going to be talking about Black Swan today, because believe it or not, she is bugged, especially on this trace in particular, that gives the team a damage bonus. And I don't think anyone has noticed this yet. We're going to be starting off with the super simple shit, like the basic attack first, and then we'll start to move into more complicated aspects of her kit, the math behind certain things when they apply, and all of the above. On top of that, as I go, I will also try to point out what has changed versus the old Black Swan, because old Black Swan had probably the worst ultimate in the entire fucking game, but now it's not so shit anymore. Starting with the basic attack, it literally just fucking deals damage. As opposed to before, it used to try and apply Arcana stacks based on whether the target had any of the respective dots. That might sound like it's a drawback since we don't get Arcana stacks on a basic attack anymore, but they did move this into a trace that we will talk about next. The trace Viscera's Disquiet. When an enemy target gets attacked by Black Swan, there's a 65% base chance of inflicting 5 stacks of Arcana on them. And so this is actually a significant upgrade over before with the bullshit where you would have to have enemies with certain types of dot on them in order to actually get stacks, and that was something that happened before with the skill and the basic attack. Now, in general, if Black Swan does an actual hit on a target, you get 5 stacks of Arcana. Now, 65 as a base chance might sound like piss. However, let's do some quick math. Against enemies with 30% effect res and 40% effect res, these are the actual effect hit rates you would need. Now, against enemies with 30 effect res, which is the overwhelming majority of endgame units, bar some of the newer bosses that are getting 40 effect res, this is the exact amount that you would need in order to guarantee that every time you go to place a stack of Arcana, it will actually apply. Now, the number here is going to look kind of funny because it's going to look really close to the number of effect hit rate that you need in order to maximize the trace Candleflame's Portent, which makes it so it'll increase damage dealt by all allies by an amount equal to 60% of Black Swan's effect hit rate, up to a maximum damage increase of 72%. 120% effect hit rate times 60% would be that 72% there. If you think that wasn't intentional, you are on crack. They absolutely gave you a breakpoint to reach in order to make it so you would not only get a damage bonus for your team, but also reach the max amount of damage in general. So 65% as a base chance in the long run might sound fucking atrocious, but on Black Swan in particular, where you're already humping effect hit rate on all your gear anyways, it's really not such a big deal. Now, however, let's talk about that trace, because this shit is bugged. It says it increases all allies, and if you've been watching all my videos lately, we try to make it a point to point out when all allies is actually lying to you. This one is sort of telling the truth, but it's still fucking lying to you. This is what makes this hilarious. In the case of this buff, it will actually apply to memo sprites, including non-targetable memo sprites. However, the catch is it will apply a buff of 0%. And that isn't just to Demiurge, because I'm sure a lot of you watching the prior videos would expect Demiurge probably to be the memo sprite that's bugged. It's not. Even if you put this on Aglaia with Garment Maker, it will apply a 0% bonus to Garment Maker. Now, someone's probably going to say, well, if it's applying the buff and it's just showing 0%, maybe this is a visual error, but it's not. I threw Garment Maker and Black Swan in the calculator. I set up a scenario and I tested against in-game values. It does not line up if damage is actually being applied to Garment Maker from the bonus. So the 0% bonus it shows is accurate. They are getting nothing, but they're still somehow getting an actual buff to display that they're getting nothing, which makes not a whole lot of sense. Now, a mildly hilarious exception to this is if you started a battle with a memo sprite, then that memo sprite can actually get the damage bonus. Most Remembrance characters have some kind of technique that helps them start with their memo sprite. Garment Maker can start with Aglaia's technique. Netherwing can start with Castrus's technique. The catch here, though, is that if the memo sprite dies, then all future summons of that memo sprite will also be attached with a 0% damage bonus. Lastly, on the traces, when an enemy target enters combat... What? When an enemy target enters combat... Okay, that's fucking weird. There's a 65% base chance for it to be inflicted with 1 stack of Arcana, and 100% base chance to be inflicted with the defense reduction effect from the skill, which lasts for 3 turns. And then after using a basic attack or ultimate, there is also a 100% base chance to inflict the defense reduction effect from the skill on the hit enemy targets, which lasts for 3 turns. This trace is actually fucking fantastic, because prior Black Swan could only ever apply the defense reduction from the skill with the skill. But now it doesn't matter if you're doing a skill, you're obviously going to apply it because it's from the skill. But now if you do a basic attack or an ultimate, you're also going to be renewing the defense shred, which is a very odd 20.8% for some fuck-ass reason. Now it's actually pretty funny here between this trace and the skill. The skill will actually apply the defense shred before it deals damage to targets. The trace, however, if you do damage through a basic attack or an ultimate, it will apply the defense shred after the fact, which is a little weird, but in the long run, that would only matter if the enemy didn't have the debuff to begin with, and considering that they will start the battle with that defense shred, and considering that every single attack you deal after the fact will also apply that defense shred, it's not actually going to matter that much. You're basically going to have 100% uptime on this shred. On the note of the skill though, the only thing that's actually different is they removed the old thing that would let it so you had a chance to apply a stack of Arcana when attacking targets. Again, that might sound like a drawback, but considering the other trace we talked about earlier, it's not actually an issue. When it comes to the skill, it says it inflicts the Epiphany state on all enemies for 2 turns, then deals wind damage to all enemies equal to 100% or 120% of Black Swan's attack, and then while in the Epiphany state, enemies take 25% increased damage. For every 1 stack of Arcana inflicted, there is a 50% fixed chance to additionally increase the number of Arcana stacked this time by 1. And then lastly it says, an Arcana stacks won't be halved after dealing damage at the start of the turn. Now there's a few things in here. Before, in the old Black Swan, the ult used to make it so targets with Epiphany were considered to be suffering from every single dot type available. Wind shear, bleed, burn, and shock. That, however, isn't in the ultimate anymore. Instead, they did something amazing, and they pushed it into the talent. Now, if anyone has Arcana ever, they will be considered to be suffering from all of those status effects anyways. And considering that Arcana is an unremovable debuff, that means all enemies will always be considered to be suffering from all of the different status effects. The other huge change here is before the old kit made it so enemies with Epiphany would take 25%, they'd get 20 vuln, or 25 vuln, but it also made it so that 25 vuln only took effect if the enemy was in their turn. I say that this was the most shit-ass ultimate in the game because it was. Let's put this in perspective, guys. You have a dot damage dealer who applies vulnerability on an enemy that only applies in their turn. And then you pair them with people who detonate dots outside of the enemy's turn. That doesn't really fucking work. The fact that they've removed the in-turn condition from the vulnerability and now it applies all the time is absolutely fucking fantastic. The old ultimate also made it so if the enemy took their turn, they wouldn't reset their Arcana stacks. So that not doing it here isn't really that big of a deal. However, if you're familiar with the old Black Swan, you know that the Arcana stacks always reset completely. And the description here on the ultimate implies that it's halved, which is a huge change on the talent. So let's talk about that next. The talent says, every time an enemy target receives 1 instance of dot, there's a 65% base chance for it to be inflicted with 1 stack of Arcana. Before we talk about the rest of this entire effect, this first sentence used to be part of the old talent, but also part of an entire old trace. One of the old traces said, every time an enemy target received 1 instance of dot during a single attack by an ally, so that's a detonation in this case, there's a 65% base chance for that target to be inflicted with 1 stack of Arcana, and then it also limited the amount of stacks you could gain up to 3. Now, however, that trace is no longer in existence. It's fucking gone. And then instead, they changed the talent wording, which used to say every instance of dot taken during a turn start. Now it just says every instance of dot. So it doesn't matter where the dot is coming from, it's no longer limited. All dot taken will always contribute to Arcana stacks. Continuing on with the talent, while an enemy target is in the Arcana state, they'll be considered to be simultaneously afflicted by all these status effects we just mentioned, and then Arcana functions as a dot itself. The target will receive wind dot equal to 240% of Black Swan's attack at the start of each turn, after which the number of stacks is halved. Each stack of Arcana increases this damage multiplier by 12%, and Arcana can stack up to 50 times. If you're familiar with the wind shear dot in general, that's one of the few break dots that can actually stack. Just think of it like that, where even at 0 stacks, if it were possible to have 0 stacks, you would deal 240% damage. damage. But even at 1 stack, that 12% for having 1 stack will still add to the 240%. It's not 240% at stack 1 and then 12% for every successive stack. They all add together at all times. The catch here, before we start talking about some stack funkiness, is that if you deal damage with Arcana, that counts as dealing damage with Arcana for the sake of the first part of the talent. But because the damage has already started, any stacks you gain after Arcana has started dealing its damage won't actually count. They'll still increase the stack amount you have, but for that instance of damage, they are not going to be factored. And that's important because say you start with 1 stack on an enemy and the enemy takes their turn. The enemy will start to take damage, and because they started to take damage, they will now gain a stack, which will put that enemy to 2 stacks. But then the attack will finish, and then the stacks will get halved, meaning you will go from 2 stacks to 1 stack. So the extra stack you gained in this scenario specifically didn't actually do anything. But if you were at fucking 30 stacks and then you had like 2 trillion fucking dot instances go, then that's obviously going to start to matter a little bit more. But in general, if you're trying to calculate the dot damage dealt by Arcana, you will almost guaranteed be 1 stack off, because too many people are trying to calculate the Arcana stack damage, including the stack it gains when it deals damage itself. While that stack is still important for the sake of having the stacks, because say you had 79 stacks and then you deal damage and it puts you up to 80 stacks, when you have, it will factor the stack that you just gained up to 80 and put you down to 40 when you do get halved. But in general, a lot of people are calculating the damage wrong because of that. And another thing to note is that also doesn't count the stacks that you gain from the ultimate. As we just read earlier, every time you apply a stack of Arcana, there's a 50% chance to increase the number by 1. And so if you are ever in a scenario where you suddenly have damage that's off if you're trying to line things up, odds are what happened is your stacks went up by 2. You're going to see that very, very, very often. But the moment that Arcana deals damage itself, it'll get 1 stack because it's dealing damage as a dot instance. And then it might trigger, if they were under the ultimate epiphany state, an extra stack gain. So you might see 27 stacks, but if you do the math, it's actually only doing 25 stacks of damage. A quick note about when Arcana will actually deal its damage. When an enemy is starting their turn, Arcana will always be the last dot dealt in the dot queue. And the dot queue is something we can talk about in another video on another day. But in general, say you have Kafka's Shock and you have Hysilens' passive talent dots on the target, they would all go first, and then Arcana would go last. This means that in general, if Arcana is ever proccing from a turn start, it will maximize all the other dots first in order to give itself more stacks before it goes. And this does include for detonations as well. Arcana will always be detonated last. However, this is going to confuse some people because a lot of people are going to say, well, what about Hysilens and all her extra talent procs? That's strictly speaking not going to be part of a detonate when Hysilens is adding her talent procs. And the talent procs are going to happen after Arcana does its damage, either in a detonate or in a turn start. And you can verify this very easily just by slowing down some footage and confirming when exactly Arcana does its damage, when exactly the stack amount will change after Hysilens procs factor in, and the difference is huge. So in general, please note that Hysilens dot procs from her ultimate's zone, they still count for stacks overall, but kind of like the stack issue that we mentioned earlier, they will not actually factor their stack bonuses in before Arcana deals damage in a detonation or on a turn start. The fish procs are always after the fact. And then lastly, these two changes are actually fucking amazing. It says damage from Arcana ignores 20% of target's defense. That means in general, all Arcana damage will always ignore 20% defense. The old Arcana had a condition where the 20% defense shred could only apply at the start of an enemy's turn when they were receiving turn start dot, and it could only apply if you had 7 stacks or more of Arcana on that target. So that it just gets to apply universally on any instance of Arcana damage is phenomenal, because that also means it's going to apply to detonations. And then the other thing they did is before, the old Arcana had another check at 3 stacks where it would deal extra damage to targets adjacent to the target who was receiving that turn start damage. Now that's going to happen regardless. It technically didn't really matter a whole lot before because reaching 3 stacks was a non-issue, but now it will always happen on any turn start regardless of the stack count that they have. On the technique, there is a 150% base chance for each enemy to be inflicted with 1 stack of Arcana at the start of the battle. For each successful application on a target, inflicts another stack of Arcana on that same target, and the process repeats until Arcana fails to be inflicted on the same target. Now, considering earlier we talked about the effect hit rate required to guarantee an application at 65%, some of you are going to read this and think, oh, well, that's fucking crazy. It's 150% base chance. There's no way we're ever going to fail. However, it does say for each successive application of Arcana on the target, its chance of success is equal to 50% of the base chance of the previous success. So that 65% gets cut down every single time you succeed. So there is absolutely a point at which you will stop applying stacks. In general, pretty much never plan to get more than 4 stacks on a single target from this technique. On Eidolons, E1 has not actually changed at all. While Black Swan is active in combat, enemies afflicted with wind shear, bleed, burn, or shock will have their corresponding wind, physical, fire, or lightning res reduced by 25%. The difference here comes from how they changed the ultimate, because the ultimate used to be the way that you simultaneously afflicted enemies with all stuff. And that way, after you used an ultimate, if you were at E1, you would simultaneously reduce all of these elements' resistances. Now, however, E1 is literally just a permanent debuff on all enemies, because if an enemy has a single Arcana stack, they will always be considered as suffering from all of those elements, meaning they will always have all of their resistances reduced. So E1 probably wasn't too crazy before, but if anything, it probably just got stronger now. E2 makes it so when enemy targets enter combat, there is a 100% base chance to inflict 30 stacks of Arcana on them. Before this said, every time you killed a target with Arcana, you had a 100% base chance of inflicting 6 stacks of Arcana on adjacent targets, which was kinda piss in the wind. I'm not saying that E2 is really that much better than before, but is it slightly less useless? Yes. E4 changed quite a bit. It says while in the Epiphany state, enemy targets take 20% increased damage. At the start of every turn or when they get defeated, regenerates 8 energy for Black Swan. The 8 energy bit used to actually be limited for 1 time per every ultimate, which was kinda fucking stupid. And then it also used to give, instead of the 20% increased vulnerability from the ultimate, it instead used to give negative effect res on the enemy, which is kinda shite. E6, as it is now, says the upper limit of stackable Arcana increases by 30. And then when an enemy target gets attacked by Black Swan's teammates, Black Swan has a 65% base chance of inflicting 1 stack of Arcana on the target, so just in general, attacks will always apply a stack. And then it says, for every 1 stack of Arcana Black Swan inflicts on an enemy target, additionally increases the number of Arcana stacked this time by 1. So quite literally, double applications always. Before, it actually used to have a 50% fixed chance to increase the amount by 1. So that 50% chance got moved into the ultimate, and then E6 got turned into a literal double stack application. And then lastly, as for gear and teams, that's not something I'm actually going to be talking about in this video. Black Swan is more like a pet rock that you set on your desk and then it launches nukes at people. But in terms of dealing her own damage, other people cause her to deal it. Whether that's Hysilens or whether you're fucking pairing her with Kafka. I know there's a lot of debate about whether Black Swan has a spot on the certain team versus Kafka or Cyrene, but that is something we will talk about when we get to videos for those characters. But Black Swan herself is not a particularly interesting character to build craft around, not unless she actually has a team to go with it. And then lastly, if you are familiar with me in my prior videos, you already know about our full Battle Sim and Team Optimizer project. After this video goes out, probably within an hour, I will put Black Swan on the live site since we've gone and updated all her code. She is now ready to go. We don't have Cyrene, but we do have Kafka and Hysilens, so if any of you want to be particularly brain damaged and work out your own teams and optimizations, the site will let you do that.